and I'll get started. So let's start with Michael, some introductions. Michael Wang. Michael, thank you so much for being with us today. Michael just told us that he's actually going to be running the marathon in New York City next week, right, Michael?
In 3 days.
In 3 days. In 3 days. So Michael's running a marathon in 3 days, and he actually took the time to come here and talk to us about a case study on how he's rolling out P2P products. So thank you, Michael, for that. If I were you, I'd be sleeping in a bed somewhere or in an oxygen tank or something trying to get ready. And Danny Danny's with us from apexanalytix. Danny, thank you so much. apexanalytix, for all of you that know, a big time sponsor of Procurement Foundry, just continuing their relationship with us here, doing some thought leadership, bringing a lot of really intelligent stuff to the platform for us and to our community. And thanks, Danny, to you for coming and to apexanalytix for being a sponsor of the community.
Oh, thanks, Mike. It's our pleasure. We really love what you're doing at Procurement Foundry, and we just hear all the time from people who love what you're doing.
That's great, because I hear from the people who can't stand it. So I'm glad that you're getting the positive feedback. I get the people who like, we lost something in the Slack channel last week. So Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your role at Panasonic, and tell us a little bit about what your roles and responsibilities are and what led to this case study. That'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. My name is Michael Wang. I lead Center of Excellence specific to Panasonic North America's procurement department. I've been with the organization for about 3 years. And how my position relates to this discussion today is I'm in charge of the entire source-to-pay suite. So we'll talk about it in the next couple minutes, but ultimately went through an entire process of selecting all the individual modules specific to the source-to-pay suite and went through that best of breed versus single suite discussion. In addition to that, I do manage the department's P&L and work on our KPIs and metrics. But nice to meet all of you today, and then hope it's going to be a great organic dialogue.
That's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And again, thank you for your time today, Michael. Danny, you want to give us a little bit of yourself on your background, who you work for, and what you do there? That'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So I'm Danny Thompson. I'm SVP of Market and Product Strategy for apexanalytix. That means I'm kind of responsible for listening to people like you on this presentation today about what your needs are in the marketplace, help drive our product roadmap around that, and then also help communicate to folks like you what our products do and how they work and how they're making a difference in our customers' lives. I've been at Apex for a little over 6 years now, but before that, I was at an e-invoicing company. And before that, I was on your side of the business working for Pfizer and International Paper for about 14 years, tied in with their shared services, transformation programs, implementing ERPs and process automation solutions.
Awesome. Wow. That's a storied career. And it's nice to know somebody who's kind of been in the industry as long as I have, because I'm starting to feel like an old guard here.
I always say when I'm around folks like the attendees that it feels good to be with my people.
Yeah. It's like, okay, I'm in with my back office folks. That's cool. So tell us just a little bit about apexanalytix. Can you tell me a little bit about a little bit about the company? I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch, but I'd like to know a little bit about what they are, what they position for people who maybe haven't heard about the apexanalytix before. What's the product? How does, what market do you service and things like that?
Sure. So we've been in business for about 30 years, 33 years. In 1988, we got our start, and we started out as an AP recovery audit business. So companies would dump their vendor masters and a couple of years of transactions to us, and we would find cases where invoices were paid that shouldn't have been paid. And then we'd actively recover that money and help identify the root causes so those gaps could be closed. And that's still a big part of our business. But what brings us here today is that about 5 years ago, 6 now, I guess, we went to our clients and said, we've been working with you guys for forever, improving processes, looking at your data. What can we do that would help solve a problem that you're having trouble solving in the marketplace, can't find a solution for. And they said supplier, the complex global supplier management problem. And we thought that what they had solutions for that, the Aribas and Coupas and end-to-end solutions. But they said, well, actually, when it comes to supplier onboarding and compliance, the problem's a lot more complex and relates to a lot more vendors than those platforms tend to focus on. And so we work with them to develop the solution that Michael has deployed at Panasonic.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually forgot that your legacy at Apex is in AP recovery, analysis and recovery, because now everybody that I talk to is talking to you about your vendor management solutions and things like that. But it's still, you're still in that business because there's still so much erroneous billing that's taking place, and it's just as far as we've advanced in the years, it's shocking to me that still is a problem, but we're still there. So I don't think it's as bad as it was. I mean, the telecommunications industry's billing was a nightmare back in the day. But anyway, I'm sorry. I don't mean to digress, but I had forgotten about that piece, and I was like, oh yeah, that's a huge piece of the history of Apex. So Michael, tell me a little bit about. Let's jump in. I want to know a little bit. Oh, let me ask a poll first. I want to ask the audience around your best of breed versus single sources approaches, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about how Michael led and still operates a project and a program over at Panasonic around the analysis of suite solution versus best of breed. And we're going to walk through everything that he did, how he did it, how they went through the deployment, where they're at now on that whole thing. But I'm really interested to hear from the audience in your strategy and in your approach, both on LinkedIn and here in the room. Are you doing suite solution based, or are you doing best of breed in your P2P life cycle? What are you doing now, and where are you going with it, right? So I don't do formal polls. I just do them off the cuff, and then I look and I make a judgment call, kind of like whose line is it? The TV show, and I'm like, all right, I'll give 1,000 points for everybody who said that they're in best of breed right now. But that said, Michael, really interested for you to tell us a little bit about the genesis of this project from Panasonic's perspective. So obviously somebody raised their hand and said, all right, listen, we need to start evaluating what our strategy is here, right? So can you tell me a little bit about where this all started for Panasonic and yourself?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of some context, Panasonic North America, we're a subsidiary of our headquarters, Panasonic Corporation, based out of Japan. But within North America itself, we have 12 different business units. And to answer your question, going back to 2019, when this initiative first started, in which we were looking at the entire source-to-pay suite, our technological landscape was fairly immature. The only piece of technology that we really had within our infrastructure was procure-to-pay product that we had with SAP Ariba. And then we had a sourcing tool that was created by a startup company. So it's fairly immature and elementary with respect to the complexity there. So we took a look at the entire source-to-pay landscape and tried to identify what we wanted to solve with respect to deficiencies that we had within our current processes. Ultimately, you could boil it down to a couple different key points. Cycle time with respect to the process itself. Cycle time specific to how long does it take the procurement team at X company to go through their due diligence? How long does it take to onboard a supplier? How long does it take to churn through a contract? How long does it ultimately take a user at the organization buy X product? In addition to that, compliance. These tools and ultimately tools help to corral individuals and decrease rogue spend, decrease rogue activity, and help to really position yourself to be that compliant organization. So that was number 2 with respect to the top 3 points that we were looking at. And then number 3 was really just to be able to have something that was able to mitigate risk. Now, we'll get into it a little bit later when we talk more about Apex and how that's mitigating risk, but ultimately passing on sensitive information via emails and things of that nature across individuals ultimately leaves us to a great deal of exposure that we did want to mitigate with respect to an audit perspective. So boiling it down to those three main needs, that effectively led us down the journey to really embark and really look at what kind of solutions would satisfy that entire source to pay suite.
All right, so somebody inside of your organization comes to you and says, Michael, we got a problem, we want to fire and fix this. And you're like, okay, I'm your guy, don't worry about it, I can handle this. Who are the stakeholders that you had to assemble on this team? I'm assuming there's some finance people. I'm assuming there's some direct spend people and some indirect spend people. There's probably some what I call traditional stakeholders, which is the marketing team, the finance team, the legal team, right? So who is when you start down a journey like this, who are some of the stakeholders that you're putting together when you start to do this? Who did you bring in?
Well, if you try to tackle source to pay as a whole, there's just a myriad of different suites that make up that end-to-end solution. So you really have to first start off by decoupling it. You take a look at something like procure to pay, in which your key stakeholders are ones in finance, corporate's account payable, and things of that nature, being able to really control spend thresholds, approvals, and what really goes through that system, as opposed to looking at a module similar to contract lifecycle management, where legal, compliance, risk, those are really your key stakeholders as opposed to accounts payable. So to go back to your question, it really depends on the module itself, but ultimately we built a cross-functional team encompassing multiple shared services across our organization, as well as multiple business units across the region as well.
I'm guessing accounts payable had to play a part in this because you're talking about vendor onboarding and vendor operations and management, right? I mean, so that's at least one of the key people that's at the table, and their flag flyer is the chief financial officer ultimately at the end of the day, right? So he's kind of dipping down into this, and you're working for a chief procurement officer, and they're like, all right, you two guys, you two groups get together and try and figure this out, right?
Most definitely, because if you look at things from accounts payables perspective, if we just hone in on supplier onboarding, we had 3 FTEs manage the onboarding process. From a cycle time perspective, if you're thinking about everything being manually passed through, it was taking us roughly 6 to 8 weeks to onboard a supplier, which is, to anybody just hearing that time frame, is fairly long. So just off the bat, 3 individuals, 6 to 8 weeks in passing information via email, there's just a myriad of different risks, deficiencies, and room for improvement specific to just that one module.
Yeah, that doesn't, I got to be honest with you, when you get up to the levels that you're playing at in Panasonic, and I saw that at Publicis Group and some of the larger multinational companies, 6 to 8 weeks of onboarding a vendor population isn't unrealistic, given the legal issues associated with the individual countries, the currencies, the bank accounts, what are the informational guidelines just for transferring information back and forth, and people look at you and go, oh my God, it took you 8 weeks, like I can put a vendor in my system in 15 minutes. What took long? It's like, yeah, when you get big, it gets it's not 2-dimensionally complex, it becomes 3-dimensionally complex in a lot of areas. So just give me a sense of so this starts out, and you got to build a case, you got to build a business case for this, right? Because the primary reason to do this is some type of ROI. Talk to me a little bit about building out the business case and justifying the effort to do this. And then can you kind of give me a scope of like what kind of budget do you, and I don't know if you know this or not, but like what kind of budget are we talking about? Like what was the total cost of what you were looking at to try to resolve, and and things like that?
Yeah, for sure. So building a business case, let me talk about it qualitatively, and then we can move to the quantitative side of things.
Perfect.
Qualitatively, I think ultimately you're looking at those 3 main points that I talked about a couple minutes ago. So if you uncouple that across the multiple suites within the source to pay platform, from a purchasing standpoint, in our historical state, we had roughly about 30 to 40% of our purchases off the platform. So what that means is some individuals not going through Ariba Procure to pay to purchase a pack of pens. They're going to the Walmart down the block to purchase that because they can save 5 cents. Now, that might sound great to that individual who's making that purchase, but ultimately that individual is not cognizant of the benefits that the organization is subject to. We may be getting annual rebates based upon tiered spend and things of that nature. And really, there wasn't a mechanism to be able to guide folks to make that process easier. From our historical insights, our stakeholders told that it was too cumbersome to go through that process. Ariba was clunky. We had too many clicks to go through that process. So we had low compliance to that regards. We move over to contracting. We talked about this before. We never really had a contracting tool. So ultimately, we had fully executed contracts stored on a myriad of SharePoints, folks' local drives, and we never really knew what we had. In addition to that, when I spoke about the 12 different business units across the organization, we may not know whether or not business unit A has a company with Apex versus business unit B. So we're really losing out on the synergistic opportunities across the organization. So just so many missed opportunities from both a savings perspective, from a procurement perspective, as well as just compliance, just bleeding cash, and really ultimately lengthening that total cycle time specific to every single one of our processes. Now, moving on to the quantitative side, what we did was we quantified how many purchases were on Ariba versus how many manual invoices needed to be processed. And that helped to really quantify the potential opportunity with respect to optimizing procure to pay. Now, when we look at a tool such as sourcing or onboarding, as well as contracting, the savings here truly is operational efficiencies. Being able to decrease the cycle time there, you're able to shift, let's say, a procurement team to be able to focus on more strategic initiatives versus more tactical. Likewise with supplier onboarding, maybe you don't need 3 FTEs to manage that process. Maybe if you automate that process to firm up the compliance and the risk mitigation, may just need 1 administrator to really go through that. But ultimately, end to end, all of these solutions put together, we were looking at roughly about $1 million of annual cost.
Amazing. I'm wow. The way you break this down is so simple for people to understand. I'm going to drive a lot of people to this discussion after the fact. I can tell you that right now, because there are so many people inside of Procurement Foundry trying to figure out how to do this and do it and the way you just articulated that is amazingly simple. And in 4 or 5 minutes there, you laid the whole thing out for us. Danny, tell me a little bit about the type of folks that are coming to you and the type of problems that they're trying to solve. And by the way, Dave's crushing us inside of the chat room right now. Dave, I am going to get to your questions. We are going to talk a little bit about integration of Apex into some of the other systems. And he had a question around who's running supplier master data record. We'll get to that in a minute, Michael. So Dave, I see you, brother. I'm going to get to you. Just give me a minute to let Danny talk a little bit about the types of clients and what are some of the reasons why clients are coming to Apex Analytics to find a best in breed product.
Sure. So the kind of customers that tend to come to us are companies that are larger enterprises that have complex procurement and supplier bases. So we're probably talking about at least a $500 million in spend, but mostly it's a billion or more, and some as in tens or even more billions, the biggest companies in the world. And they are usually trying to address their strategic P2P process and just look for opportunities to improve everything associated with P2P, sort of the way we're hearing Panasonic approach this. And they're looking specifically, in our case, they're looking specifically on how to drive compliant onboarding of suppliers and fully engaging 100% of their suppliers in everything that they're doing. So that's one category. And then another pretty big category of companies that come to us are trying to address a specific fraud, risk, or compliance problem that is active. Maybe they've had an incident that they need to get a hold of, or they're seeing a rising risk associated with their vendors that they need to address. And so, they need a solution that's going to try and automate as much of the compliance process and the supplier onboarding process so they can ensure consistency and compliance.
Yeah. So, really, really smart, right? They're either, hey, we just got burned on the fact that we don't have enough checks and balances around the fact that somebody changed their banking information. We paid the Cayman Islands for 6 weeks and didn't know it. And now the vendor wants their money too, right? Or, hey, I'm on a 3 to 5 year transformational program and I'm looking at carving this out into small chewable bites, like Michael, who's saying, I want my vendor relationship management, but I want all the functionality that comes with a niche play like yourself that gives me 100% of the functionality that I need, right? In that particular element of the entire P2P thing, right, Michael? I mean, we talked about the fact that, there's due diligence, there's vendor onboarding, there's contracting, there's request to delivery, there's, integration into ERP system and payouts. There's trade working capital improvement. All of those things are part of that equation, right? But if you slice it all down and you say, okay, let's just talk about the vendor onboarding and vendor management part of it, that is part of the larger strategic process that people are attempting to achieve, like Michael, right? So it makes completely logical sense to me that they're either trying to fix a leak in the dam or they're actually reconstructing an entirely new dam. Is that safe to say?
Exactly, spot on.
So, Michael, go ahead.
No, you're spot on. Specific to our case.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about this. I mean, Panasonic's a beast of a company, right? I mean, they're global, and there's multiple divisions in there and multiple companies. This is what I call geopolitical maze, if you will, of companies, right? And when you try this on for size, you don't try to boil the ocean, right? So is it safe to say that, you decided to say, okay, you boiled it down from the entire P2P process just down to master vendor data and said, okay, let's go fix that. But did you do that just in North America to try it out, or the headquarters? Or like, where'd you start? You get a win, and then you parade it around town and go, hey, look what we did. You should do this too, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to dive right into it, our scope is specific to just North America.
Yeah.
Each of our regions are on different ERPs in different instances. So specific to everything that I'm talking about today is centric to North America. Now, going a level below that, I mentioned earlier on this conversation that we have 12 different business units. What that means is 12 different systems or instances. From a ERP standpoint, we have about 54 different instances across the entire organization. So extremely fragmented in that sense. So how do we go about, tackling this? Because as procurement professionals, we all understand that integration into multiple ERPs is cumbersome, and being able to tackle that is a grandiose task. Yeah. What we did is we started off with our headquarters based in Newark, New Jersey, and really tackled all of the different companies or cluster of companies within that office location. So in totality, we were able to cover roughly about 75% of North America with our instance of SAP. Now, to kind of fast forward over to how we're expanding it across the organization, right now we're looking at expanding and actually finishing up the implementation for Apex for our avionics division in Southern California, who's on Oracle. So a completely different ERP platform. And we're also rolling out or planning to roll out differing sourcing as well as contracting platforms across those entities as well. So really not boiling the ocean, proving the business case and making it successful, and showing those metrics with respect to the operational efficiencies as well as compliance and savings. And that really helps us sell the other business units because we have that autonomous structure and being able to opt into that ecosystem.
Is this resonating with you, Danny? I mean, you're talking multi-billion-dollar shops, right? And I know Michael said 54 ERP systems, right? And it might not be 54 different titles, but it's 54 different instances, right? So within those 54 instances, there could be 12 instances of Oracle, right? There could be, 3 NetSuites, at different levels and different versions because they've been bastardized down to become customized deployments. Plus, on top of that, you got the M&A team bringing you new stuff every week, right? So is that resonating with you, Danny? Are you seeing this on a regular basis?
Yeah, it's pretty common. I mean, we see both extremes, companies that have one global enterprise-wide ERP, and then many others. That's pretty atypical.
God, are they lucky?
It's very common for companies to have multiple. And one of the things that our clients, asked us, required us to do with this portal was make it so that the supplier gets a single experience across, because they don't need to understand the complex architecture inside the client's environment. They just need one place they can go to manage their profiles. And so we just had to architect the system in a way that it could support all of the ERPs on the back end, but provide that single face to whoever's using the solution. But and it's pretty common for companies to either buy the solution for one region and get it going and then market to the others, or in other cases, companies say we are implementing this globally. We're going to do our North American SAP instance in this 3-month period. Then we're going to do Europe's Oracle instance the following 3 months. And so they tend to schedule those things out as well.
I am much more of a, in my opinion, I'm much more of a, hey, listen, let me go spend $200,000 with you, prove out the business case before I go spend $1.5 million with you. And that way, when I show up to all the other CFOs around the world, I've already got my business case, and I'm not trying to sell something. I'm just trying to show them the value proposition, and we're moving on, right? But that's just my own personal preference. So really quickly, I do want to jump into one of these questions from Dave. Dave says, and by the way, Dave doesn't have to be the only person asking questions, but Dave, you're doing a great job. Who manages the supplier master record, AP, procurement, dedicated function, i.e. those 3 FTEs focused on it were in which department, Michael?
Yeah, so let me tackle the tail end of it and then come back to the front end. The 3 FTEs I was talking about specific to manually maintaining the supplier onboarding process. 2 of those individuals were on the accounts payable side, and one of the individuals was on procurement operations. So ultimately, not jumping to the punchline, but we were able to, and we'll talk about it later, achieve operational efficiencies by streamlining the process and ultimately being able to truncate and shuffle some of those FTEs. Now, to answer the front end of your question on the supplier master record, SAP is our source of truth. So without getting into the weeds of the entire Apex process, once a supplier goes and completes the registration process within Apex, that information is fed into SAP, and then an SAP vendor number is created. So SAP is ultimately our source of truth. Everything comes and stems from SAP, and that is ultimately maintained in conjunction with our IT as well as our finance team.
Yeah, so SAP is your system of record, but you're leveraging Apex, and I don't want this to be the Apex show, but it is. I mean, so you're leveraging a third-party best-of-breed solution to be able to get the optimization, the onboarding cycles down, be able to get what would take 10 people down to 3 people, get self-service windows for onboarding, things like that don't necessarily function very well because that's not SAP's primary focus, right? They got it. They got 60% of it, but you can really enhance it and get 7, 8 FTEs out of 3 if you go to best of breed, right? Yeah,
let me just give you 2 nuggets. One is specific to what type of information can actually be housed within SAP. So SAP is able to house an remittance address or one singular email, but as opposed to what we're utilizing with apexanalytix, you can house and you really use it as a supplier Rolodex. So you can have your account manager, the leadership individual, the person at accounts receivable. And then on top of that, one of the big things that we're utilizing Apex for is supplier diversity.
You're answering another question. Hold on one second.
Never had
somebody asked that question. So there you go. There's your answer. I'm not going to ask that question. Thank you, Michael. You just answered it.
So we never had an avenue with respect to SAP to be able to house and report on what suppliers are diverse. In the past, folks were in different business units were housing it within a spreadsheet or on a local drive, but Fairly manual, again, being with 12 business units, not in cycle when you look at the holistic perspective. So Apex allows us to now house the diversity-based certificates, as well as all of your other different certificates, such as your W-9. Talking about the 3 FTEs and the manual processes there, I'll just mention one of them. To test the validity of a bank account, we historically, or in the past, we had one individual do a manual penny test to deposit X amount of dollars into the bank account and see whether or not it's a legitimate bank account. On average, that was taking 10 business days. So if you look at cycle time, you have 10 days of just dead time where you're just waiting. With Apex Analytics, because the tool is able to perform real-time verifications and validations, that 10 days is immediately cut down to a matter of seconds or just a singular click.
Yeah.
So you take that off the bat without doing anything else in terms of streamlining, and you're already minus 10 days with respect to your cycle time.
Yeah, I mean, if your cycle time for onboarding a new vendor is 6 weeks, you just knocked 10 days out of that. You just knocked what, 18% of your 18% of your time is gone, right?
Right.
Yeah, perfect example of one little thing, and you just get 18% more approval. I mean, 18% more efficiency, and that 18% more efficiency just translated into one more FTE in a team of 5.
Mm-hmm.
Done.
Exactly.
Game's over, right? So, I mean, the ROI on that, Danny, is not difficult, right?
Yeah, and there's a second component to actually both of those things, bank account and diversity, if you'll let me talk about them for a second.
Go.
Yeah, so bank account has just been a huge challenge for clients for the past year and a half. Really, COVID made everything worse because things like callbacks, people weren't at their desks anymore, weren't answering phones, and the level of fraud associated with bank account through business email compromise has just skyrocketed.
Sure
in
it does.
the past 2 years. And so we've been working with our clients and with the banking systems and some global governments to really beef up bank account validation, including bank account ownership validation. So actually testing, who does the bank say is the legal owner of the bank account? And is that your supplier or is it somebody else? And that automated validation really creates this level of confidence that you can't even really get with a penny test. Because what a penny test does is it tells you the person you're talking to on the phone has access to that bank account, but you're still not sure whether they work for the supplier or not. So that's been a huge driver for a lot of folks in the last year and a half. And then, of course, diversity has been really blowing up as a focus area for large companies. And so to help with that, we've had a lot of requests for validating diversity information around suppliers and helping people identify diverse suppliers. So we've added 100 external data sources to validate and append diversity data to suppliers. So we can get that external certification confirmation as well as just capture the certificates for people. So yeah, both of those get helped.
Yeah. So a couple of things really quickly. I'm listening. I'm talking, and Hope asked inside of the chat, is this going to be available? And I know Tina answered. Some people want to go back and watch this again already. Yes, so we do record this. We are instituting at Procurement Foundry a historic library. I believe this will be the first webinar, thought leadership webinar, that will go up on our historical library off of our website. But in addition to that, because this is being broadcast out onto LinkedIn Live and onto our Twitter feed, you can go back to our LinkedIn Live feed and watch this entire episode in its entirety. If for some reason you can't, just reach out to us. We put links inside of Procurement Foundry so that you can click through. All Procurement Foundry members have access to all of our content at all times, and Procurement Foundry is free. To the question that came in over the internet, they asked a question about how are you integrating new topics like ESG and sustainability into your process, and I think Michael answered that already, and we just talked about that with Danny and how Danny's doing that. And what I think is really interesting is you're right in lockstep with what we're seeing, right? I get a lot of folks like Danny and the Apex team and a lot of other vendor population out there saying, Mike, what is the community talking about right now inside of Procurement Foundry? And earlier this year, supply diversity inclusion by far the number one topic. And then number two became risk mitigation after that. And believe it or not, cost reduction was number three. Cost reduction is now moving into number four in our list of things that people are talking about, because talent and talent issues inside of our industry has quickly jumped inside of Procurement Foundry up to number two and is challenging diversity and inclusion for the number one seat right now. As far as vendor diversity and inclusion versus just finding new talent, because as we all thought, the talent, we laid a bunch of people off when COVID hit, and now we need a bunch of people to come back and save us all money. And it's like, we can't find them. So I love the fact that you're tracking and your company is tracking with what the industry is saying inside of my community. And Michael is also tracking with that. And it looks like so aren't the members. So things that are resonating with all of you are what we're hearing about inside of the industry as well. And just a shameless plug, we do have a supplier diversity and inclusion conference in February. That's going to be our first conference of the year next year. So want to go back to your case study and a quick question on that. So, okay, so you got your business case, you know what you're going to fix. You're not going to try to boil the ocean. You narrow it down to one process. You got your stakeholders. You find, you do your tool analysis, right? And part of this is deploying this thing, right? Michael, you got to deploy this thing, because let's be honest, I bought some really, really good software in my day and dropped the ball on the deployment. And then the CFO is like, this thing is a piece of dog food. Why'd you bring it in? I'm like, but the software is amazing. The professional service team is horrible. I don't know what, you know what I mean? So how do you evaluate that? Because that's an important part of success, right? So I'm assuming that, you're looking at, and I don't know how you're set up, Danny, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this, your internal professional services organization versus third-party partners and things like that. Michael, you had to run down that path, right? How people probably want to know, what's that piece of it like too? Because you can buy the best piece of software in the world. I know people who deploy NetSuite all day long. Some of them hate it, some of them love it, depending upon the Oracle, partner that you get, right? So yeah. I'll start with Danny. Danny, how do you approach it from that perspective? And then Michael, what were you looking for as success?
Yeah, so there are really two components to this. How do we plan for the deployment, and then how do we deploy? And we plan for the deployment before the contract is signed. We've just found it's so important to have what we call an implementation planning session before the contract is signed, so we can really nail down what's the scope of this implementation going to be, what configuration, what processes do we need to configure for the client? What are the things that are most important with them? That way we can plan out the implementation services component of the contract appropriately, right size the team, have a clear understanding of the timelines before we even sign the contract. So
yeah, because you can't have a client out there saying, hey, I bought this software and it stinks, when the reality is that it's really entirely possible that they didn't put enough resources against it for success, right? I know a lot of professional services organizations in-house that are waiting on the client to give them some type of information back. And all of a sudden they sold a great piece of software to a bad client. And now somebody's getting up on social media and talking about how bad it's going. And it's like, all right, you're the reason why it's going bad. But I can't say that because you're the client, right?
Yeah. And we don't want to get into a situation where we're saying, oh, wait, that scope that we weren't planning for, we're going to need more funding to fund this implementation plan. We need all of that straightened out at the beginning, so there's clarity and everybody's aligned. So that alignment is super important.
You don't want to be a big three consulting firm that's constantly looking for new generation of revenue with extended statements of work. You want to get in and get a success story so you can sell more software. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. We're about solving the problem. And then the second part of that is, are we implementing ourselves or with third-party system integrators? And the answer is both. Certainly we're directly involved on a lot of our deployments because we use that to learn and enhance and drive best practices. And then we have system integrators really to help with scalability, and they bring a lot of expertise as well.
Cool.
So we're using both models today.
Nice. Michael, after your evaluation, what did you choose and why did you choose it?
Yeah, so ultimately we're going through this RFP process to select the application, but as on the side, we're also going through another RFP to select, what implementation partner we're ultimately going to use for the life cycle of that project. Looking at the differing suites, and ultimately, it's not a shocker, we went with a best of breed approach. We did look at, the in-house implementers such as Apex or DocuSign or Jagger, their in-house implementation teams, versus our preferred partners, so Tata Consulting Services and et cetera. And ultimately boiled down to building a detailed scope of services, as well as looking at the qualitative and quantitative side, benchmarking, timeline, as well as effort on both sides. Ultimately it shook out that we utilized all of our implementation partners were from the vendor itself. So we used Apex and their team to implement a supplier onboarding portal. We use the DocuSign team to implement contracting. We use Jagger's in-house team to implement Jagger, and then SAP Ariba for Ariba. So really, we went through the due diligence and put that business case for internal versus external, but ultimately we went to that in-house model.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, listen, it's pretty simple, right? You buy an automobile, you either take it to the dealership to get it serviced, or you take it to the guy down the street. Sometimes the service technicians at the dealership are horrible, and the guy down the street's been working on Mercedes Benzes for a lifetime. You know what I mean? You can find, I've seen it go both ways, and obviously it's a make or break situation. I feel awful for the technology firms whose professional services organizations drop the ball on the implementation and the follow-up, because you got a great product, but then the professional services, because it's a horrible reflection ultimately. So you really got to, and then there's other times when I would think, Danny, as a technology firm with a professional services organization, there's some things that you just have to go, hey, listen, man, this isn't our expertise. We're not great at this. We don't implement, we don't get into, I don't know, some bizarre European ERP system that nobody's heard about. That's a German thing for automobile manufacturers. I recommend you go with a professional service organization to help you build it, especially when you get into custom bastardized ERP systems, right? Like that's kind of like listen, bring your guys in to figure out how we're going to talk.
Yeah, there's certainly roles for different providers in the implementation process. And sometimes they're like components that people want to plug into our onboarding process that might require some outside expertise. There's actually another really interesting model that just happened. One of our clients is Cemex, the building materials company, and they own their own professional football team, soccer team. And they wanted to add that business into their supplier portal implementation and use the business rules wizard inside of Apex portal to just do it themselves. They didn't have time to get onto our calendar. So they used the tool to deploy a whole business group on their own. So that's kind of an interesting model as well. Yeah.
Question from Danny inside of the room. How do Apex validate the bank? I want to go back to banking for 1 second. Do you Apex validate the bank account is correct format, or is the actual bank account of the vendor in question? We covered that already, right? We already covered the fact that you do that. We do $1 drop, 1 click, all of that. We do that, right?
Yeah. So we're doing all of what you've described using a variety of external data sources, as well as our 55 million record database of suppliers doing business with the world's largest companies, and the history of that bank account being used for the same supplier across the network.
God, this is a great topic. We're getting tons of questions. I think this is for Danny. Also, any process mining you have done in the transformation process to identify hidden process leakages? I know you talked about that a little bit. So have you done that? And this is a good point for us to shift. We got about 15 minutes left. Actually, we got 13 minutes left. I want to make sure be aware of time. So now you deploy the thing. It's all going well. You're in operational mode. Are you comparing where you were versus where you are? And I think I'll take that down this process mining route to determine the transformational process and what was hidden and what wasn't. So tell us a little bit about where you are right now and what you've seen for process improvements and process leakages now that you've actually deployed this thing. And what is some of the success? What are some of the KPIs that you're running against? How are you measuring all of that? Because that's probably what people want to know next.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I'll just use two examples, procure to pay as well as supplier onboarding. For procure to pay, the way that we're measuring success, three metrics that we look at is how much spend is going through the catalogs. So catalogs, for example, catalogs at Staples are set up within the procure to pay system for ease of transaction. It takes an individual, 3 to 5 clicks to get from start to finish. So we want to understand how much spend out of everything that's being transacted is flowing through that catalog that does not require an FTE's touch. The second thing is, and third thing that we're measuring is the amount or the number of non-catalog invoices or invoice exceptions that individuals are processing. Ultimately, that's a variable cost because we have procurement operations individuals who their sole job is processing non-catalog purchase orders or invoice exception purchase orders. So the way to define success with respect to procure to pay, and this is just really simplistically putting at it, the more spend that's going through the catalog and the less the lower amount of invoices that are being processed by an actual FTE, that shows you that we're really streamlining the process and driving individuals to utilize the system. Now, in terms of Apex and how we're really able to measure the success of that, cycle time is your key indicator. I mentioned earlier that we were going from 6 to 8 weeks. We've had Apex live and been able to track it now for about half a year. The first quarter, about 47% of our suppliers were onboarded within 14 days. 57% were onboarded within 14 days that next quarter. So you can see that we're really shifting the dynamic with respect to automating that process and being able to get folks, paid in a much quicker time period, going from that 6 to 8 down to half of our suppliers being onboarded within 2 weeks.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So, Danny, let's talk a little bit about KPIs that you recommend to your client population associated with success, with being able to track success. Do you have some recommendations for people and when they start to optimize their supplier vendor management processes on what KPIs they should be tracking as well?
Yeah, so some interesting things that we see clients tracking are payment automation adoption. So a lot of companies are using this onboarding process to try and drive suppliers to electronic invoicing or electronic payment, or driving them to create accounts on their P2P transaction networks. So those are three things that we think are really good for people to track: increased adoption of automation. Another one that really our solution just kind of takes care of for people, but usually creates a pretty dramatic improvement for them is, do I have tax forms for all of my individuals? Do I have the appropriate insurance documents for the suppliers that need them? How many are expired versus current? Different metrics like that are pretty good for people to measure as well, as things that could be improving with these solutions. And then another is how many suppliers are being onboarded through this process. And you should look at that no matter what your onboarding process is. In our case, the majority of our clients are saying every supplier, regardless of type, has got to be onboarded through the Apex portal, and they don't create vendor masters directly inside their ERP systems. Even if they're specialty vendor categories, like maybe a member of the board of directors or talent, or someone where there's somebody inside the company creating the vendor master for this supplier, those get done in Apex portal rather than directly in the ERP, so that all of the normal validations and controls can be applied, even if those validations and controls aren't built into the ERP itself.
Yep. Cool. So let's talk. We get about. I'm sorry, geez, we only got about 7 minutes left. I thought we could do 2 hours on this. Michael, you're amazing at being able to tell us all how you went through this process and what you took. I love the fact that you broke it down into quantitative and qualitative for us. You broke down all the different stages associated with what you're trying to fix and what you're not trying to fix. So now that you've gotten there, you've deployed this, you've obviously had success with it, you're optimizing your staffing levels, you're improving your metadata associated with your vendor population, you're improving process, which is huge because that means you don't have to hire more people, or at least more people to do this. You can upskill them and take them from a tactical position of sending out $1 cent transactions to and letting the machine do that. And now they can do a lot more strategic thought processing. Tell me about where you take this now. I'm interested to know, as a huge global, highly complex organization, where do you go next with this? And also, if you can follow that up with what's next for you beyond the Apex? I mean, it's almost like okay, listen, I've fixed this. I now need to just roll it out and get adoption, right? Which is probably a communication and internal sales job. But then what's next for you? I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, geez, this guy's solved one of these riddles. What's the next riddle?
Yeah, so tackling the application question, now that we've rolled it out and gone live with respect to our headquarters, what we're going through right now is implementing it and rolling it out to other individual business units who are not on our ERP. So I spoke a little bit earlier that we have an avionics division outside of within Southern California. They're going through and implementing Apex as we speak. We're also going through the process of being able to integrate our contract lifecycle management tool with our business unit down in Georgia. That's our automotive division, as well as our Tesla Gigafactory outside of Reno, Nevada. So being able to take the metrics and the value add and articulate it similar to what you had said, use our facts and the real historical data to help drive that business case to be able to sell that to our other stakeholders. Now, with respect to what's next, there's a couple of things that are, in the pipeline as well as ongoing. I think user adoption is something that you're always going to have to plug away with, especially from an organization like us. We don't have dedicated PMOs. It really falls onto my work stream to be able to, train and make sure that users are utilizing the tool itself. What we've employed is, putting up, step-by-step guides onto our intranet, recordings, webinars, training sessions, and things of that nature across the entire organization to help to try to spark, user adoption. And then in addition to that, working with human resources to make that part of the curriculum for new hires. So being able to tackle it from a couple avenues, from legacy employees as well as new employees. And then from a procurement perspective, what's next? About 6 months ago, we relaunched and wrote up a brand new procurement policy. So being able to articulate that and couple that / marry that with the different technologies of how to promote the engagement with procurement and the ROI of procurement, that's top of mind. And then lastly, we're working on implementing supplier relationship management to help segment our suppliers, put together comprehensive cloud-based scorecards and risk mitigation factors to really look at all the activities, post-contract once you have a supplier in place.
Yeah. Prakash, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think it's Prakash. Prakash is asking a question about implementing cases associated with the P2P solution on manufacturing company side. And obviously Panasonic is a manufacturing company, and talking about direct material side and how this might fit into the direct material side as well. I don't think we have time to answer that. I'm assuming, Michael, if that's okay with you, Prakash can reach out to you either through the Procurement Foundry. He can reach out to you in the water cooler or track you down on LinkedIn. If he's got a specific question, he can ask it. Or if you want, we can leave it up. Prakash, you can throw your question up into the LinkedIn feed from this discussion, and maybe Michael will be kind enough to go into the LinkedIn feed and maybe answer a question for you, or Danny can look at it as
And I
well.
think that's more of a question for me too, because it's P2P, which isn't isn't Apex part of Apex's suite.
Yep.
So you can follow up with me offline.
Yeah. So if you want to contact Michael offline, he's running a marathon in 3 days. So why don't you check with him next week? But he might be able to help you out, and that's part of what we do here in our community, is connecting professionals to get better intelligence. So super excited. We got 3 minutes left, gentlemen. I want to ask you my final closing question. I ask the same question every time. I'll start with Danny and then I'll end with Michael. If there's one thing that our viewership today, our audience today, should take away from this session, what is the one thing, what is the one chewable nugget that they should take away associated with improving their vendor management, vendor relationship management, and the case study that we just ran through with Panasonic on suite versus best in breed? I'll start with Danny.
Well, our view on it, based on our feedback from our clients, is that vendor master and supplier onboarding is really complex, and it's very important because it provides the foundation for everything that follows in that supplier relationship. Yep. And so it's really important to hit that, make sure that you got that down solid. And then leverage that onboarding process, not only to ensure compliance, but to drive adoption of all of your other P2P initiatives. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Michael, one takeaway for everybody who's in your position right now, who's like, oh my God, I got to go boil the ocean, or I just got handed this transformation. I just became the head of transformation at this company. Holy cow. What is the one nugget you can give these folks that are staring into the abyss for 2022?
I think ultimately, I would really boil it down to really understanding your stakeholders. What are the deficiencies? What are your current processes? What are you trying to solve from a short-term as well as a long-term perspective? Seeing other organizations, even ones within Panasonic, fail because they don't know where they want to go. So before you even go down the path of understanding what tools are in the marketplace and things of that nature, I think it's paramount that you need to understand what is your current processes, what are your current processes, and where do you want to go? What are the deficiencies? What metrics do you really care about? And that'll help to define your pathway forward on being able to select the right tool.
Fantastic. Amazing hour. It went by ridiculously fast. I'm going to go back and watch at least the first 30 minutes of this. There's about a dozen things that Michael said in the first 10 minutes of him talking that you can use and put into a PowerPoint slide to outline your strategy on how to attack a transformational project like this. If you didn't catch it all, like I didn't, go back, chew on it, write it down, and use it. Don't reinvent the wheel. Michael's done an amazing job here of giving us blueprints into a case study associated with analysis. Now, some people are going to choose suite. Some people are going to choose best in breed. Some people are going to choose different technologies that are running these different things. But there is absolutely one thing in common with all of them. They're all trying to optimize your performance for success and to optimize the teams that you have, upskill them, and make sure that you get value and present yourself in the procurement arena to your to your bosses, that you're transforming your company and bringing intelligent thought process to your companies. All right, everybody. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for your time today. Good luck in the marathon, my friend. If you could do us a favor, could you post up to us how you did? I'd love to know how you did. I don't know if you put that on LinkedIn or in Procurement Foundry. I'd love to hear about that. Sure. I'd love to follow up and maybe rant and rave about your success to the community. And that'll remind me, actually, I want to find out if there's any other Procurement Foundry members that are running in the marathon. Danny, thank you as always to the folks at Apex Analytics. You're a great team. You know that we don't publicly endorse any products or services, but we'd like to thank you for your sponsorship and for presenting events like this where there's thought leadership coming out. This has been an exquisite hour of intelligence sharing. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it, guys.